Welcome everyone again to this webinar, Queer Theory on the Rise with Olof Edsinger. So a special welcome to Olof, who will be speaking to us tonight. So first, let me just introduce him briefly to everyone. So Olof is the General Secretary of the Swedish Evangelical Alliance. And before that, he worked for 9 years as the General Secretary of SALT, which is the Youth and Children's Organization of the Swedish Evangelical Mission. So he has worked a lot with youth and children, especially on the national level in Sweden, where he's from. So he's also a leader of the church and of a church plant in his hometown, Uppsala. And in addition, he's author of 15 books, mostly about the Bible and Christian discipleship. I have also read some of his books. And he's married to Mona, and he has 3 children. And we thank you again, Olof, for your time tonight with us in this webinar. I think we're all looking forward to your sharing on this very important topic. So before I turn it over to Olof, just for a reminder for everyone to use our earphones, possible, and also to mute our mics if we're not speaking. We have 45 minutes of teaching for Olof, and then after that we'll have some Q&A discussion part where you can give your questions to Olof in the chat box or to just address him directly. If you have no more questions, then I turn it over to you, Olof. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. It's an interesting topic, and it's a topic that just some years ago was almost never heard of in, at least not evangelical circles. Queer theory, and the way I see it, this is not a topic specifically about sexuality, but also rather about sexual identity. And many of you may be more familiar with the term transgenderism or trans, but I will cover both those topics today. And they have slightly different meaning. In Sweden, we have seen actually more of queer theory, but I know in other parts of the world, for instance, I think both America and Great Britain have talked about transgender. And we will cover both those topics. But I started to sort of encounter this new way of thinking when I read a report about the latest school materials that were used in the Swedish sexual education. And there were several things that struck me looking at these materials. And one thing that was that sex was actually always almost presented as an individualistic phenomenon. So it was never connected really to stable and loving relationships, at least not as a particularly good or natural context of sex. None of these 4 materials, and they are the biggest materials used in Sweden right now, even mention that you can have sex within a marriage. And I think that's quite a telling detail. 4 materials on sexuality in Swedish schools, and none even mention that you can have sex within a marriage. That is perceived as being sort of normative in a wrong way. There was no information at all about how to build a strong and lasting relationship, but one material gave some instruction as to how you can quit or leave a relationship. So that's something, but none about how you can actually make a relationship stronger. Once again, that was perceived as too normative in a negative way. Another interesting detail was that 3 out of 4 materials chose not to talk at all about the biological side of sex. For instance, the possibility of getting pregnant and issues surrounding that experience. So all in all, sex was removed totally from the context both of marriage, stable relationships, and pregnancy. So that was just like the first glimpse of what was going on in Swedish schools. But then, of course, the second question is what was then talked about in these materials, and that's where I sort of stumbled upon this new phenomenon in Sweden, at least, called norm-critical pedagogy. And this could be expressed in different ways, and I will give you a couple of quotes. Here is one from one of the materials. Despite information and legislation, the heteronorm is still fortified in society. One is presumed to be a heterosexual until one openly show or tell that one has a different sexual orientation. Parents may presuppose that their children grow up to form heterosexual core families. That was one way of putting it. Another material shared its concerns this way. There is still a strongly dominating mindset in society concerning how one should be and how one should live. It is often presumed that you should love someone of the other sex and want to form a family consisting of mother, father, and child. It is often called the heteronorm. And one third example could be this, and here the reference is made to the animal world. Sometimes it is said that there is a kind of sexuality that is more biologically natural than another. But through studies of higher standing animals, and particularly our closest relatives among the anthropoid apes, one has found that they are acting out their sexuality towards their own as well as the opposite sex. And then on another page, they post this question: is it at all desirable to be normal? I don't know about you, but these are slightly different, these presentations, than I was used to when I was attending sexual education in school. And they made me curious, you could say, because there are some common threads here. One is the critique of the heteronorm. I don't know if that is an expression that you are familiar with, but that's how it's expressed in Sweden. And another common thread, you could say, is the overall critique of wanting to be normal. Or even the concept of normality, you could say, is something that is questioned. Does normality exist? And when I sort of started to scratch a bit on the surface on these words, that's when I also came across what we call queer theory. And once again, I suppose you may be more or less familiar with these things. But just to make a brief historical overview, you could say that the women's movement that was formed in the end of the 19th century, that movement fought for equal rights for men and women, for instance, concerning the right to vote and in public elections. But the starting point for that movement was that men and women are different but equal. That was sort of the obvious starting point. We are different but equal and should have the same rights. So our biology and our gender roles differ, but we should still be treated in a similar way. So that was the first wave of well, it was called the women's movement, but then we talk about the second wave of feminism, and that's the one that evolved in the 1960s. And I think that movement has shaped the West, at least, very much. Definitely Sweden, very much, but I think the whole of the West. And one big thing with the second wave feminism was that the concept of gender roles as a social construct was introduced. So the biological sex, one would say, is a fact. It is there, but the social consequences of our biological sex are not at all as fixed or as rigid as was said before that time. It was quite a radical movement at the time, but today I think most also Christians would agree with the basic idea of second wave feminism, that is, that the biological sex is fixed but there are a stronger sense of fluidity with the gender roles. Once again, we may have different backgrounds there, but certainly that is true of Swedish Christianity. But the revolutionary side of queer theory is that in queer theory, it's not only our gender roles, but also our biological sex that is perceived as a social construct. And that is totally new. And because in this way, one has declared, you can say, a war on all ways of connecting the word normal to our way of talking about sexuality. There is, according to queer theory, no such thing as normal sexuality. Rather, our sexuality is viewed as something fluid, and therefore one can oppose all traditional norms in this area. For instance, the heteronorm, and the heteronorm could be defined as simply saying that the majority of the population is heterosexual and should be expected to be just that. Unless you actually come out as something else, then of course everyone knows that and relate to that. But the sort of normal starting point would be that most people at least are heterosexual. That is the heteronorm. There is also the two-sex norm, or the binary norm, telling us that humanity, for the most part, is consisting of women and men, and also that is just as it should be. And once again, that was hardly controversial some years ago, but for queer theorists, it's the actual enemy to oppose working with these issues. So you can definitely see a progression here. And we could go deeper into that, but we'll see if we get back to those issues during the Q&A. This may sound quite extreme, of course, to anyone with a more traditional view of this subject. But the queer thinking has made a very strong impact on the international LGBTQ movement. There was about a decade ago a big discussion within this movement about which strategy one should use to advance LGBTQ rights in society as a whole. And in those days, it was actually not called the LGBTQ movement. It was called the LGBT movement, as you may remember. And before that, it was the LGB movement. So also there you see this progression. But during these discussions, that on one had people inspired by queer ideology, and on the other side, the more traditional gay movement. And that was the people that had been fighting for gay rights, for instance, the right to marry or the right to adopt children. But the queer ideologists basically accused the gay people or the gay rights people for having a too narrow agenda, or even confirming in a wrong way the heteronorm, because they were fighting to have the same privileges as the heterosexual part of the population. And then the queer theorists would say, well, by striving to get the same privileges, you're actually affirming the heteronorm, saying that that is something desirable, if you follow the line of thought. And that sort of called for a revolution within that movement. And the queer ideologists, they wanted to go much further than the former gay movement, because they claim that all fixed labels when it comes to sexuality are counterproductive. And their vision, you could say, of true freedom for sexual minorities was that no one should be able to call himself or herself normal. Because if no one is normal, then everything is on the same sort of base. And also there is a strategy here that the way to fight hostility and discrimination towards sexual minorities must be to say that everything is just as normal as the other, because only then there is no ground for discriminatory behavior. That's how the ideas were put forward. And as you, of course, have guessed already, it was the queer movement that won this internal war. And after that, this was also the LGBTQ movement. Just some kind of historical sketch. Are you with me so far? Yeah, well, we continue some more then. I haven't even mentioned transgender yet. I will do that quite soon. But already now I think that it's quite obvious why trans and queer have sort of gone very much hand in hand. Because to be a transgender means to have a gender identity that does not correspond to your biological sex, at least not as it was designed or assigned at birth. And also it often relates to a person who doesn't live in such a way as to conform to the norms or the gender norms connected with their biological sex. And in one way you could say this supports the queer ideology. Yeah, I had a slide on this one too, I see. Because since queer ideology talks about sexuality as something fluid, with no given starting points when it comes to sexuality or even sexual identity, well, that goes quite well with the transgender way of thinking. But another thing that I think is important to point out here is that neither queer nor trans is specifically about sexual promiscuity. We may connect parts of the LGBTQ movement with promiscuity, but this is not necessarily so. I would rather call it a radical kind of individualism. Everyone sort of defines himself or herself, and everyone should be free to define his or her sexual orientation without any real reference to your biological prerequisites. So in that sense, you can also see that the transgender population embodies a kind of new ideal, even a new kind of salvation message. And that is basically that you can be whoever you want. You don't need to conform. You can rise above creation itself and define yourself as you want. And I think that is one reason why this ideology has become so popular, because it sort of connects with the sentiment of our Western culture today. And some trans people have also been almost like heroes in our culture. And we have participants here both from Europe and America. So from Europe, you could mention Conchita Wurst, a drag on the Eurovision Song in Copenhagen in 2014. But in America, you would have several people, of course, but one famous would be Caitlyn Jenner, former Olympic gold medal athletic, who was born as Bruce Jenner, but changed into Caitlyn in 2015. And both these people, Conchita Wurst and Caitlyn Jenner, have been very much pushed out in the center of media and some kind of heroes, modern heroes. And I think that is because they embody this new kind of ideal, almost like a salvation message. So how did these still quite extreme ideologies become mainstream in such a short period of time? Well, I will return to the issue of trans a bit later. But when it comes to queer, I think a key to understand what's going on around queer is the concept of intersectionality. Once again, you may or may not have heard of intersectionality, but it's hot stuff in the universities in Sweden, especially, of course, if you do gender studies. And I looked at Wikipedia, the English version. They define intersectionality as an analytic tool which attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalized in society. Intersectionality considers that the various aspects of humanity, such as class, race, sexual orientation, disability, and gender, do not exist separately from each other, but are complexly interwoven. So the point here is that marginalization comes in many shapes, and that many of these cooperate to create hierarchies, and those are, of course, both for good and for bad. And in this way of thinking, if you are, for instance, male, you are privileged compared to women. If you are white, you are privileged compared to people with colored skin. If you are heterosexual, you are privileged compared to homosexuals, and so forth. So this, of course, means that a white heterosexual middle-aged man is on top of the ladder, while, for instance, a black homosexual woman would be more at the bottom, and even more so if you are transgender. So when you combine this way of thinking with more of a Marxist or a postmodern ideology, you get a situation where the tables are really turned. From a postmodern point of view or a Marxist point of view, the issue of power is more important than the issue of truth. So the one who is oppressed or underdog would be the one that you would normally support from a Marxist or also postmodern way of thinking. Truth is not a big issue in that context. So you may have, for instance, being a white heterosexual middle-aged man, you may be having the best arguments for your case, but from a power analysis, you are on the wrong end of the ladder, and therefore no one would basically care about what you're saying. Whereas the one who is on the bottom of that ladder, even though his or her arguments are quite poor, he or she would have a strong influence. And to me, this really is one of the major explanations for why the LGBTQ movement has gained such a strong impact in the West. Because from a Marxist or postmodern way of thinking, this is the group that we should listen to, not those who would oppose it, no matter how the arguments are formulated, if they are good or bad. This in turn makes the postmodern culture very interested, and one could even say obsessed with minorities, especially if those minorities are perceived as oppressed. And therefore, this, I think, explains why radical ideologies such as both queer and trans have gotten such a strong influence. They are, you could say, they fit into a larger narrative of this radical individualism, where everyone defines him or herself. It's also some kind of idea of the man being the master of creation. I can actually rise above my own physical limitations, my own body, my own sexuality. I can define that. A very attractive thought. And basically, as I said before, a kind of salvation message. And also, as number 3 in this slide, the narrative of the minority as an underprivileged people group that should be listened to in another way and more than the majority. So that is one way sort of to present this ideology and put it in some kind of perspective. Then I said I would return to the issue of trans or transgenderism. And as I already mentioned, queer theory would say that sexuality is something altogether fluid. So you can go back and forth on a scale of heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, or trans, and you can go back. So you can come out as a homosexual and then after a while realize that, well, I sort of evolved and I'm now a transsexual, and then you can go back and maybe even become a heterosexual once more, because sexuality is defined as fluid. I would say transgender is same but different, because with trans you have more of a metaphysical definition of sex. If you are transgender, generally identify yourself with the opposite biological sex. And you may have different sexual orientations. You can be trans and be a heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual or polysexual or whatever label suits you. But in your mind, you perceive yourself as something else than the sex that you were assigned at birth. So in that way, you have a metaphysical definition of sex, completely detached from your body, your reproductive organs, your chromosomes, and also your hormones, those things that also define our sexual identity. And I have started to make sort of a sort of, what do you say? Two different views of trans, one being trans as a diagnosis, and one being trans as an ideology. And when you look at trans as a diagnosis, we know that there is a very, very tiny part of the population. Most statistics would vary between 1 in 5,000 and 1 in 30,000 that may get a diagnosis called gender dysphoria. And the latest issue of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders talks about 6 criteria, and you would have at least 2 of these to be getting the diagnosis gender dysphoria. And you see them on the screen. My personal view is that the church should treat the kinds of people that get this diagnosis in a respectful manner, for sure. Well, we should treat everyone with respect, but I would also say that this is a legitimate diagnosis in some specific cases, and they may need some kind of medical treatment. My sort of problem arises when the very unique and specific perception of sex and sexuality that comes with these people who have this diagnosis, well, that is sort of generalized as a view of sexuality for larger groups of the population. And that is definitely what is happening around the world, and certainly in Sweden. So queer ideology would view sexuality as something fluid. Trans ideology would be that it's in your mind. This has become a really big issue in the last few years, particularly within schools. And it creates quite a few new challenges compared to, for instance, the issue of homosexuality. Because for transgender people, are very practical consequences of identifying as trans. One big issue has been the access to bathrooms and changing rooms. And that would probably be familiar to all of you, because that has created quite a stir in media. Another issue would be the pronouns that you use to address a trans person. And once again, this is unique to trans because people who are homosexuals, they would not necessarily need other pronouns or other changing rooms. So that's kind of a different situation. But here we have this new kinds of demands also coming from the trans movement. And we actually just recently had a visit from Jordan B Peterson, also in Sweden. I think he's quite a global phenomenon. And he attracted big groups when he was speaking, also in Sweden, as some kind of counter movement to some of these things too, I think. And certainly not only Christians coming. I would say most that attended those meetings were not Christian. And I've been speaking a bit with friends from both America and Great Britain. And I realized that trans is high on the agenda there. I just want to give you some examples, and this is from some guidelines released by the state of Alberta in Canada. But I know that there are similar documents around in several places. And it's very interesting. This is actually targeted at the teachers and principals of schools. And they start off this whole manual by saying that self-identification is the sole measure of an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And I think here we really see this radical individualism in full bloom. What they basically say is, don't engage the doctors, don't engage the psychiatrists. Self-identification is the sole measure of your sexual orientation, which means that this, for instance, 12-year-old at school who says he or she is something totally different than most people would say, you can't even question that. You shouldn't even ask the professionals because it's the individual who is Lord, ruling. And this is very significant for this movement. This material also points out, for instance, if you write official letters as a teacher, or just how you communicate in the classroom, it's the issue of pronouns. And there are new suggestions here like sie, he, they, or them. Or if you write home to the adults at home, you would say dear Mr. or Mrs. normally maybe, or something like that. But now it's suggested to say dear MX, for instance, instead, to sort of take away the gender factor. Obviously, you are not allowed to have school uniforms or dress codes that makes it impossible for boys to wear skirts. And the school should also avoid sports or maths competitions, it said, where boys compete against girls. And the same applies, of course, to sexual education, because to have girls and boys in different classes for sexual education would sort of send the signal that they may have different questions in those issues. And that is not considered appropriate anymore. So there are new ways of thinking here. But also we have this part, as I already mentioned, with the bathrooms and change rooms. So first in this manual, they state that students are able to access washrooms that are congruent with their gender identity. But of course, then you may have a quite problematic situation where you have had your what do you say, physical education, is that the word, I think? And you go to the changing rooms and you have 20 girls go into their room, and then someone turns up looking very much like a boy. And the girls may have a problem with that. But since you cannot discriminate a minority, what is actually said is that those who object leaves. Theoretically, you have 20 girls leaving and the boy staying for simply not being allowed to discriminate this minority. A student who objects to sharing a washroom or change room with a student who is trans or gender diverse is offered an alternative facility. And they also point out that if mom and dad react to this back home, it's their child who should be punished. So the parents cannot sort of overrule this. Of course, this has caused quite a stir, as I said. And from what I have understood, this is also quite similar to the rules that the Obama administration tried to enforce on the state, local schools all around America. So there were 13 states that sued the federal level on this matter. Not necessarily because of the sexuality issue itself, but also because it was seen as an interference of what should be dealt with more locally. But I suppose you Americans would know more than me about that, but that's what I sort of picked up. Do you recognize it? Yeah. Just going back to Sweden for a little while before we open up for Q&A. We have been more influenced by queer theory than transgenderism, actually. I talked to a guy called Peter Linus at the Evangelical Alliance of UK, and he said that maybe it's because the LGBT issues are so strong in Sweden, so we don't sort of need the trans issue as much in Sweden to open up the whole issue of LGBTQ. Whereas in Great Britain, the LGBT issues are not pushed as far as in Sweden, and therefore the trans issue has become sort of a door opener to this whole way of thinking. I think it's an interesting theory. Because you can certainly say that Sweden has gone very far when it comes to these kinds of issues. And I just put this up as a kind of summary of the laws within the, well, both, of course, the state, Sweden as a nation has laws, but as you see, there's also the largest Swedish denomination, the Lutheran Church, which used to be a state church, has also gone very far in this area. Even so far as to suggest that all local parishes should be LGBT certified. That has proved to be harder than they thought when they said that, but still it's the sort of direction things are going. What has happened in recent years is that queer theory has been increasingly important in the way that Swedish schools and also preschools work with issues such as equality, discrimination, and anti-bullying work. Before you would say that you would try to create tolerance for minorities, and you could, for instance, invite a homosexual, practicing homosexual to the classroom, and he or she would be able to share how his or her life is sort of, well, working. And you would be encouraged to tolerate also the minorities. From a queer perspective, that is totally unsatisfactory, because queer theory says that there is no such thing as normal or abnormal. There is no such thing as majority or minorities. Everything is on this fluid scale. So from this perspective, in Sweden, the queer thinking has influenced very much how you work with these issues, with discrimination and anti-bullying. The focus has very much been to normalize homosexuality, or rather, you could say, to say that no sexual identity is more normal than any other. And actually, quite a strong critique has evolved around the tolerance as a whole. The queer ideologists simply don't like tolerance pedagogy. They want norm-critical pedagogy, because that questions the whole idea of normality, and the way of creating anti-discrimination would not be to create tolerance, but simply to tell people that there are no significant differences between us. There is no such thing as a majority that should tolerate the minority. And that is certainly a different mindset than it used to be. And I just want to give you some examples of how this, besides the norm-critical pedagogy, was developed in Sweden in relation with a professor from San Francisco. So we imported some of the core issues from San Francisco, but it has become very strong in Sweden, also involving several public authorities from the Swedish state. And I just want to give you a couple of examples from the public authority working against discrimination here in Sweden. And they sent a document to all Swedish preschools that included this kind of instructions. If you are planning for separate activities for boys and girls, think it through. Be aware of the fact that it can contribute to upholding and strengthening the two-sex norm and create a risk for children to experience the method of working as unfair or offensive. Make sure there are gender-neutral bathrooms so that children don't need to choose between the girls' and boys' toilets. And one could, of course, have good reasons not to separate boys and girls more than necessary also in preschools, but the point here is not really that. The point here is that they want to erase the two-sex norm. That is the idea that your biological sex as boy and girl has something to say about who you are. And that is much stronger than just talking about pedagogy of not splitting the boys and girls more than necessary. Another example from the same manual: the preschool can advance children's equal rights and possibilities irrespective of sexual orientation by making sure that issues concerning homo, bi, and heterosexuality are equally treated and integrated in the activity. To embrace and make different family structures visible is a prerequisite of every child being able to feel pride of one's own family. A concrete effort is to make sure that the preschool has children's book about rainbow families. Once again, I don't know how things are where you live, but this would certainly not be the kind of manuals that were distributed when I was a child going to preschool. Also, these are very strong words. Issues concerning homo, bi, and heterosexuality should be equally treated and integrated in the activity. That is a strong agenda, but this is very much influencing the whole of the preschool system in Sweden. And just one final piece of advice from the Swedish state, which I think is quite telling. The staff should look over if the activity is marked by the heteronorm. That is, that the starting point is that people are heterosexuals. A promoting effort is, for instance, not to speculate if Karen and Mohammed, 3 years old, have taken a liking to each other and are a couple in the making. Now, as you see, they specify these are 3-year-old children, and they say that you cannot even sort of hint at a 3-year-old that as a boy you may be falling in love with a girl in the future, because that is taught, well, perceived to be making the two-sex norm or the heteronorm stand out as something more natural than anything else. Yeah, well, so these are some examples of this, and I would like to give some more information about my worries about this because I certainly have worries about this, and also give some more Christian points of view and or biblical references to this. But I think it may be good that if we stop here and give you the ability to comment or ask questions, and we able to have some more sharing, and also maybe a Q&A after that, if that's okay.
Thank you, Olof. Yes, so we'll open now a discussion, go to Q&A. And as I said before, you can actually address your questions to Olof through our chat box, or to address your questions directly just to him.
Olaf, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question on...
Go ahead.
I had a question on your perspective on trans as diagnosis.
Yes.
You mentioned the DSM, and in America, it seems like there is already a notion that anything showing up in that manual, that trans would show up in that manual is already hurtful. And much like homosexuality being removed from the DSM 3 or 4, there are efforts to remove trans from DSM 5 or 6 or wherever we currently are. I was just wondering if you had any comments on that or thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, well, there was a big discussion when they released DSM-5, both if it should be there and how it should be presented. And they changed the terms between DSM-4 and DSM-5. So there was definitely some change already made. And the first thing I would like to say is that everything concerning trans will always be extremely controversial, because the trans movement are very, very aggressive on anything that would sort of give the notion that some self-identification would not be correct. So there is, of course, a legitimate discussion around this, but it also, you will not find any statement anywhere around transgender that is not questioned if it's not just totally say anything is as it should be. So that is just a general sort of thing. But I think still there is quite a big difference between homosexuality and transgenderism, because at least some people who are trans would demand having, well, first of all, hormone treatment, which is a medical treatment, and in many cases also surgery, where you take away working body parts. So you would need some kind of diagnosis to justify cutting away things from your body that is not malfunctioning in any other sense. So I really can't see how you would sort of remove the concept of this being a disorder, because if it isn't, why should you have treatment? And of course, all trans people don't want treatment. And that is also part of this issue, that you have quite a big group that just want to self-identify and expect anyone else to treat them as they want to, with no medical justification whatsoever. And we actually have an incident just a few weeks ago in Norway, of all places, which is not known for being extreme in these issues. And that was actually a woman who went to the gym and taking a shower afterwards, and realizing that beside her stood a man, and she just asked, "Oh, well, you must have come to the wrong place, haven't you?" But she said, "No, I self-identify as a woman." But he had not undertaken any surgery or anything. So she went to the desk complaining and said that, "You must talk to this man, because we don't want him in our shower." What happened is that he sued her for discrimination, because she questioned his self-identification.
Yeah, and that's kind of why women.
And from what I have presented here, that in one way makes sense, but on another hand, it certainly does not make sense at all. So it sort of illustrates the complexity of this. So I think we will have quite a few counter reactions, and I think we all already see that, because as I said before, it's a totally different thing with the homosexual community. They don't sort of demand anything from anyone else, but these people certainly do, and they demand quite a lot from quite a few people. So that would be my comment on that one.
Yeah, thank you.
But you're free to both ask more and also disagree. I mean, these are new and also tough issues.
Could I ask one more question? You may be familiar with a philosophy professor from, I believe, Rhodes College in Tennessee, and she was fired and lost her tenure track position, as well as there was a retraction from a philosophical journal because they published an article where she wrote about a speculative philosophy that was comparing our receipt of Caitlyn Jenner as a heroine and with this woman in Seattle who identified as transracial. She identified as a black woman, though she was of Caucasian origin. And it was a speculative philosophical piece just juxtaposing our approach to transgenderism versus transracialism. And it sounds like you're familiar with it. I was wondering if you'd done any reading or had any commentary on how we are holding this particular issue differently than we may other issues of intersectionality.
Well, the basic issue is very similar, because in one instance you had a person self-identifying with a race that could not be sort of legitimate from her body. And in another case, you have someone identifying with a gender identity that could not be sort of, well, in Caitlyn Jenner's case, I haven't sort of looked into that if he or she actually has the diagnosis gender dysphoria. Since he was undertaking surgery, I suppose he got that diagnosis, otherwise that wouldn't happen. So that may be a special case, but still it's, well, I don't know enough about that, but it speaks into the same kind of ideology that I can self-identify apart from any sort of visual proofs of my identification. And to me, that is both philosophically and medically a big problem. But I do respect the fact that there is a small minority of people who are transgender and need some kind of treatment and definitely some support. But we also have quite sort of the statistic or evidence from how that what that makes with people is we had a big study of the first 20 years of sex reassignment surgery in Sweden, and they asked those people after 20 years how they felt emotionally and psychologically, and it turned out that it was 20 times as many who committed suicide in that group as in the population as a whole. And those were the ones who had transitioned. So one can at least say that it doesn't solve all the problems. I'm not saying that they were necessarily unhappy with their surgery. Some were, but most I don't think were. But it didn't solve all their problems. And this is one of the big issues around this is many of those who want to change gender identity have some kind of diagnosis. It could be, for instance, in the, do you see autism? Do you say that? Autism is very common among those people. And you also have a very new phenomenon now called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which differs from classical sort of transgenderism from that if you are genuine transgender, normally that would be at least partially seen already when you're like 3, 4, 5 years old, starting to sort of relate in a different way than the other kids and so forth. But with rapid onset gender dysphoria, those are people in their teens or even above in age start all of a sudden, sort of out of the blue, identifying as their opposite sex, with no history whatsoever that the parents have seen of this being a sort of ambiguous view of your sex or your well, gender identity. And this, interestingly enough, is much more common among girls than among boys. Medical transsexualism is more about 3 times or at least 2 times as common with men as with women. That is biological men. But rapid onset gender dysphoria is, I think, 4 or 5 times more common among girls. So here we have a strong parallel, and also many of these have a psychological diagnosis of other kinds, often several diagnoses. So there is a strong parallel here between rapid onset gender dysphoria and anorexia. You say that? Anorexia?
Yep.
Yeah, because you have the same kind of young girls not feeling well, getting a wrong sort of view of their body. And to me, it's really scary that this is just sort of treated by many people as we shouldn't ask any questions at all. We should just go with the flow and do what they ask us to do. Especially since it was a peer-reviewed article written just a few months ago by an American researcher, and she found that it was, well, she talked about peer contagion. So almost all these girls and some boys who had come out as trans had one or more friends who had done the same. So very much sort of getting inspired by your peers. And to me, all these things sort of tell me that something is going on here that we should be very careful with.
Olof, what's when you talk about this kind of revolution within the movement in the past 10 years, is there like one particular thinker or document or some sort of statement of the vision or the goals of that emerged from that conversation? Or are we just sort of having to pick out the threads here and there as they show up culturally?
Well, the background to queer theory, I would say it on a general term, it's about, of course, postmodernism as a whole, and also the power analysis of postmodernism. But also when you look at feminism, it's the school of constructivism, because that's how things started with viewing your sexual identity as something that is made, not something that is. So you would have essentialism on the one side and constructivism on the other side. And it's constructivism that has sort of been the seedbed of this way of thinking. But the interesting thing is that lately, both in Sweden and I know in Great Britain, it has been a big clash between also constructivist feminists and the trans movement. Because, or we call them radical feminists, because the radical feminists, they have sort of woken up and realized that, hey, if there is no such thing as a biological sex, then why should we at all consider women a specific group to work for? I mean, the concept of feminism needs women as a concept, but the trans and queer ideologies undermine that whole concept. And also you have a big problem with when these feminists are out having speeches around in campuses and other places. There is always someone from the trans movement standing up and asking, well, hey, how do you sort of relate to the trans community? And they are quite sort of disturbed, to say the least. Had a big clash in Swedish media in our biggest, or several of the biggest magazines in Sweden this spring between radical feminists and trans activists, and they really were not getting along. So to just see, because that had no connection whatsoever with Christianity, because these feminists hate Christianity too. but they are almost desperate now, seeing, because the young generation are more into third wave feminism, which is much more inspired by queer theory. And then, of course, the great ideologist of queer theory in itself is I just lost the name, but I'll get back to that one. But you may know already. What? Well.
Elaine Paglia.
Is this someone from the US?
Yeah.
Paglia?
Judith Butler?
Yeah, Judith Butler, of course. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just
she's
here. Yeah. She's very important because she made this academically sort of legitimate. Mm-hmm. And she was the one who introduced the concept of both the biological and social sex as fluid, rejecting sort of all traditional concepts when it comes to this. issues. Yeah.
I should ask about the church. Yeah, I've got kind of a church response question to get your advice about. I mean, in some of the worlds I travel in, you see like the Jordan Peterson response to all this, which I take as kind of a secular response to queer theory. And I find myself, agreeing with him a third of the time. Or some of his conclusions I'm with, but not the way he gets there. But I'm wondering, do you think that there's or how would you suggest the church responds other than the Jordan Peterson kind of?
Yeah, I would like to say some more about that. So I could try to make it a bit more systematic and get back with the PowerPoint. Is there anyone else who want to ask something before that, or otherwise we can take like 10 minutes to answer that? I would love to do that.
I have a question. One thing that kind of confuses me is when a lot of people make this argument based on that small sliver of people who are born with both female and male seeming genitalia.
Intersex.
Yeah, intersex. Yes, exactly. I'm wondering if you could just address that. Yeah.
Well, basically, once again, the whole ideology around this is to make the experience of the minorities the norm, because the experience of the majority is perceived as oppressive. And that's why you will always, as I would say, find a new minority where we have sort of checked off the trans movement, that well, then there's probably the intersex movement, which is even smaller. So that's sort of the dynamic of this. And of course, the way I view these things is that you simply can't make norms for everyone from the minorities. It's as simple as that. And I understand and respect the minorities' desire to be sort of normal, to be mainstream, because you feel sort of, it's like stressful to not be within the sort of with the majority. But I simply think that it's impossible in this case to grant that wish. But in Sweden, this is also big within an entirely different movement, and that is working with disabilities and that kind of issues, where we have had this concept of not being, I don't know exactly the English words for this, but disabled would mean that you are not really normal in one sense. You are disabled. But that would be a normative statement. And they would say, well, hey, who says that you're, for instance, if you are blind, and even more if you are deaf, because that's a very strong community. And they would very much now oppose saying that being deaf is a disability. They would say, no, this is just a variation. Mm-hmm. I have the variation of not hearing. Mm-hmm. And that is very similar to the queer thinking, because they don't want anyone to point their finger at them and say that they are less normal than anyone else. And in one way that is honorable, I suppose, but it also creates many strange situations. Because of course, if this is just sort of a variation, why should anyone care or trying to help or making resources or whatever to make life easier if it's just a variation? So it's not only sexuality issues. My real worries about queer theory, and you have heard some worries now also about transgender, because that is even a newer thing with, for instance, rapid onset gender dysphoria. But we have an increasing psychological ill health in Sweden, increasing very rapidly in the last years. And I think that has many reasons. And actually one of the major reasons probably is, our smartphones, people sort of getting just engulfed with the things going on in social media and so forth. But I also think that an environment where everything is floating is really an environment where people are not thriving. It's hurtful for or you could rather say God created some kind of order in cosmos and in our lives, and when things are just floating, that is not heaven, that is rather hell, to put it simply. I would also say that it's an do you say encroachment or a betrayal, you could say, of the young generation, to let them or not let them be proud of their biological sex. Because that's what's happening here. You are said to or encouraged to question your biological sex. And as I mentioned from the manuals from the Swedish state to preschool teachers, sort of questioning the two-sex norm and this kind of stuff, I think that takes something away from the majority. Those who would not need that kind of struggle. And maybe you could say that previously, say 5% maybe had this extra intense struggle with their identity during especially teenage years. Well, now you sort of force that kind of struggle on 100% of the children. And that, I think, is a betrayal of the young. And also this, of course, opens up to sexual experimentations. Because if you say that there is no such thing as male and female, and there is nothing more normal with heterosexuality than homosexuality, for instance, well, that basically tells you that you may have sex with anyone, and you don't even need to be in love, because that's another thing that is very, very strongly conveyed in many of the books that I have read, is that, well, the so-called love norm, that you should actually be in love with the one you have sex with, that is also a norm that is questioned. And my simple thought is that if you have had 5 boyfriends and 5 girlfriends, you may have quite a baggage to carry. But I think this is what's happening with this kind of ideology. You are encouraged in many ways to experiment, and I think that is not good for the youth. From a Christian perspective, I would add some other things. Unfortunately, I don't have this on the slide. I thought I did, but the first thing is that the two-sex norm, if we call it that, is very foundational. We see it already in the creation account. And it's actually the first thing that is said about man and woman. We are created male and female. But you also see that this applies to norms and orders in general. When you read the creation account, you see that God sort of splits darkness and light, water and ground. He creates the animals in the different species. And after the flood, the Noah flood in Genesis 8 and 22, it's also another time when God sort of pinpoints that he wants to keep these binary opposites of creation. I didn't have that verse written here, but Genesis 8 and 22 you can see for yourselves. So here I see 2 very foundational principles that this challenges the queer ideology. I would say that the queer ideology also has a point when it says that our identity is not fixed, because also from a Christian point of view, we do become sort of as beings, as humans, in relationship with others. And the deepest way of becoming as a Christian, of course, is in relationship with God, realizing who he is, and he is our source, and he is also someone that we can relate to. But the idea that our identity is not fixed is also something that we can sort of share with the queer movement. And also the fact that no one is completely whole in his or her identity. And here you could relate to Romans 8, 22 and 23. And I think this is important because sometimes it's put forward from Christians also that, well, it's sort of, I myself am sort of as a heterosexual, everything is just as it should be with me, but these are the sort of strange people. I don't really see it that way. I certainly see that God is has a thought with the two sex norm and heteronorm, but we also should be humble in the sense that we should communicate that in one way we are all broken, and that is part of the fallen creation. My problem with queer theory is that queer theory would elevate that and make that sort of the new normal. Whereas I would say that from a biblical point of view, we should still sort of look back on the Genesis account and see that is our sort of goal. And there are also some very basic things from scriptures, and actually not necessarily from scriptures, but as rather from biology as a whole. We need both men and women for procreation. There is some kind of complementarity between the sexes that is acknowledged both in the Old and the New Testament. Paul, for instance, can write and relate to the men and women separately in several of his letters. So we have that also in the New Testament. And as I said, it's together that men and women are the image bearers of God. So to take away that dimension totally would in some way take away something that is integral to our being created in God's image. Another point where I disagree with many feminists is that there is a thought, at least within constructivism, that the only way to become equal is to be similar. And there is a strong need to sort of criticize the idea of men and women being different, because then there is the thought that if we are different, we be equal. And I think it's one thing that Jordan B. Peterson has been working a lot with, and what he says from what I have understood is that we should have equal opportunity, but we can never have equal outcome. And I actually agree with that one. I think that we should have equal opportunity, but in some areas at least, we will never have equal outcome. It's simply not possible. But that is the big clash here, I think. And you may want to comment on that one, but then I have said something about that too. Just finally, I would say that to me, it's also important to say that queer ideology, I have read several books now from people who adhere to that ideology. Hardly anyone ever mentioned anything about biological research or even psychological research. So to me, it is very much an ideology and it's not science. And always when I have been working with this issue in the public arena, I have written several articles in secular magazines. I never ever speak about the Bible in those articles, both because then simply people wouldn't listen to me, but also because I don't think it's needed. I simply go back to established scientific research in these areas, coming from biology and psychology, and they do not affirm of the queer ideology. And then of course you have this more general idea that we often may bring up also when it comes to the LGBTQ movement as a whole, that our sexual identity certainly is important, and maybe we have made it a bit too small a factor in church sometimes, but still compared to the LGBT movement, then you make very much of your sexual identity, and I think that you make too much of it. I don't think it's fair that our sexuality or sexual identity should be the defining part of our identity. I don't find that in the Bible, and I think it's actually quite dangerous to make it such a strong part of your identity. Finally, I would say that to me, when I read Romans 1, which is, of course, a famous part of scripture, but also one that relates to this issue of homosexuality, why does Paul bring it up, and same-sex relationships? Well, I think he brings it up because this text relates to some kind of creation norms or creation orders. And I have come to think about the heteronorm a bit like if you have an ecosystem. You know, with an ecosystem, you would have different species. They are dependent on one another. And if you take one species out of the equation, that may affect in many different directions, this ecosystem. I don't know if you follow me in that picture, but I think that what happens when you sort of take away the heteronorm, that is, that you say that your sexuality, or that is no such thing as a more normal sexuality than anyone else, well, then you sort of downplay automatically your biological sex. You downplay things such as procreation. It simply gets very many new dimensions. And I think that is why Paul actually gives so much room to this issue when he talks about the fallen sort of humanity. Because what I see in Sweden is that when you sort of pull the plug, when you take this small issue out of the equation, so much else is happening. On Swedish Facebook nowadays, you can choose between 70 different gender identities. So it's male, female, and 68 others. And to me, that says something about this fluidity. There is simply no limit. When you pull the plug, sort of, something is happening with the whole system. And of course, theologically speaking, this is also, the way I see it, some kind of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism has present in the church and also, of course, in society as an ideology where you look with suspicion on creation. And in the classical Gnosticism, you would also view God as creator as an evil God, because he created he created creation, the material world. And that is something less valuable than the spiritual world and the soul. Well, to me, queer theory and also trans ideology is in some way a new kind of Gnosticism, because it does just that. And that would make us suspicious, I would say, about these ideologies. Although I try to sort of understand and certainly don't question the motives of the people who are pressing for these ideologies. I think they most of the time have good motives, but I think that their strategy is simply not a good one. I think it has too many downsides, that strategy. Yeah, well, that were some final thoughts. We do have time for comments and questions on that too, I hope.
Yeah, thank you, Olof. Yes, we have time for maybe one or two questions before we end. Anybody else has a pressing question? Okay, go ahead.
I don't know where this would take us. It might not be helpful, but something that's coming to mind is what you spoke of how power structure is more important than truth. And power struggle comes out of norms being used against minority. And so I'm just wondering if there's any importance for the church in discussion around this to do some repenting, or if that's been a helpful part of this discussion and entering with people who are on such a fight for minority voice.
Oh yeah.
Is repentance or you know, some sort of apologetic around that important in all this?
Well, there certainly is. And I think we have lots to learn from the basic sort of experiences that have led us into the more postmodern era. I don't sort of oppose all postmodern thinking. But to me, I would go to a text such as John 8, where you have this exactly that kind of situation, where you have a power analysis with mighty men taking a vulnerable woman into the open field, trying to stone her. But what does Jesus do? Well, he sees through the power dynamics and sort of sends the men away, but he also affirms the truth issue, and he says, go and sin no more. And I would say that is an excellent example of seeing both perspectives at the same time. So we need both, simply put.
Yeah. That's...
And some churches would need to repent more on one part and others on another part, and I don't need to decide which one, but certainly we should be very humble in that area, in both perspectives, I think.
Can I ask a question? In your desire, or I don't know, is it more of a practical concern to privilege the majority? And related to that, when we're talking about creational norms, and I think about natural theology, but there's like interpretation of creation, right? And I think people who espouse queer theory would actually say, well, we're actually interpreting creation wrong. That's why I brought up intersex.
Right.
They would say, look, well, this isn't creation. Why aren't we allowing this to color our interpretation of creation?
Yeah.
Well, to me, the Christian answer to that would be that the Bible acknowledges that creation is fallen. So that there are parts of creation that don't really conform to the ideal. I would say no parts of creation conform to the ideal, but in the midst of that, God still upholds some ideals, both in the New and the Old Testament, relating to these.
Queer theorists might say, well, he's upholding it in the minority of the intersex, and that's the creative norm, and it's the minority. You know what I'm saying? Like, who's to say that the majority is the creational norm? I'm just...
Well, because our whole biology affirms that norm. I mean, procreation is the only biological function that we are in need of someone of the opposite sex. All other functions in our bodies work fine with ourselves. This is the only thing that we are in total need of someone else, of the opposite sex. And nothing can change that.
I don't think I disagree. Sometimes I wonder if these natural theological arguments are as shut and tight sealed as we would hope that they would be. And I in my interactions with people of differing views, definitely these arguments don't carry much weight, whether or not they should. I'm just putting that out there.
No, and I certainly know that, but my point is that if they are not convinced by that argument, it's not just Christianity or the biblical perspective that they are opposing. They would oppose the whole natural sciences field too.
Or much of it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, most of it you could say, but I will still say that I haven't seen a peer-reviewed scientific article from natural sciences that oppose the male and female as something in sort of, well, necessary part of creation. But of course, I mean, there are coming new perspectives everywhere.
And we wouldn't want to say that natural science is the authority over what is true and good in reality either.
No, but we would say that as a Christian, truth is always my best friend.
Yeah.
And to me, that includes good science.
Yeah, good science.
So, Olof, you mentioned some resources there at the end of your outline. But are other than sort of individual thinkers, are churches coming together in any sort of conciliar discernment and speaking to this is what we affirm to be true in Scripture. This is therefore what our theological vision is. This is therefore what we see as false teaching with this regard. Do you know of church bodies that are doing that, other than sort of individual writers and thinkers?
Well, there was quite a big group from America doing that, but I was not only happy about that one, because it tends to become a bit like holding up your signs with all the correct answers, and that sort of doesn't really solve the problem, or it definitely doesn't create good communication. So this is very hard. When you do like a manifesto about these things, it tends to be counterproductive. On the other hand, I'm quite disappointed with big parts of Swedish Christianity that simply don't speak out at all. Because to me, this is a big issue of people actually will suffer from this.
And that's why I'm less in terms of an apologetic manifesto that the church is bearing witness to the world, more of a pastoral, catechetical.
Yeah, this is part of the diaconia, I would say.
Yeah, for teaching and nurturing the church.
Yeah. And when we don't take any pastoral responsibility for people being hurt in our society from these kinds of ideologies, I think that is a betrayal. I do realize this is very hard, and that we get many people angry at us if we do it, especially if we do it the wrong way. but to just sort of look the other direction, I don't see how that could be an option in the long run. Because these are on the top of the agenda, these ideologies. They're not just peripheral, they are on the top of the agenda in the Western culture right now. So we need to have some way of relating to it.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you. Go ahead.
Right, Jonathan?
What's that?
You just
Did she say time's up?
his new book.
No, go ahead. I think.
It's
one last question.
it's just it's a quick add-on, I suppose, to Andrew and Jonathan's question. I mean, Andrew used the statement, "Are we privileging the majority?" And my concern would be, it feels like on the apologetic front with the world primarily, but secondarily, even with the catechesis of our own people, there is already and often the perception that the church is willing power.
Yeah.
And particularly when that's coming from a white heterosexual male such as myself. So you're almost your truth is already subjugated before you even open your mouth. Yeah. And that happens publicly in the world, but also personally in the church. And I'm just wondering if you had any wisdom on how do we handle that?
A Southern white male.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the development from tolerance pedagogy to norm-critical pedagogy. And I would say, in one sense, I would prefer tolerance pedagogy, because I think the norm-critical version is simply not, it's too problematic. But we also need to realize that we need to move actually beyond tolerance. We need to move into the realm of love, because that's really what is needed here. Of course, we cannot settle with just tolerating the minorities. That is not that's not enough from a Christian perspective. From a societal perspective, that may be what we can achieve together. But from a Christian perspective, we really need to be in the realm of love and respect. Of course, we then have another problem, and that is that love may be perceived today as something that only affirms everything, and that is not true either. But we ourselves need to really be honest about our own attitudes there, and we cannot settle with just tolerance. We need to love. and people need to feel that they are loved. Of course, in a quite heated climate, and as I said, the trans movement is, I think, maybe the most aggressive movement I have ever come across, maybe compared to the animal rights movement. Part of that, who can sort of burn down stores and stuff. And I also talked with some people in Great Britain working with these issues, and they were really astonished by these fierce reactions. So I don't really know how that equation can sort of be handled, but if we put that specific group aside, we have a big other group here with the LGB and more just uncertain people, and they of course need to be welcomed in a proper way. What that means, yeah, well, we don't get all the answers there on this seminar. Sorry about
Our
that.
time is up.
Time is up.
Maybe, Olof, we can have part 2 of this and invite you again. So thank you everyone for your participation tonight, especially from our delegation from the US. But we have also those who joined us from Scotland and from the Czech Republic, of course. Thank you, Olof, for giving us your time and also your experiences, knowledge on this phenomenon. Thank you for helping us understand it better so that we can address it. Also, as you said, the challenge actually here is how to address this issue in a way that we as Christians also uphold the rights of the minority, but at the same time hold truth as well. So love and truth, which is both a challenge we have here in addressing queer ideology. So thank you for that, and would like to end with a prayer. If we could ask you to pray with us, pray for us, and yes, and after that, I'd like to remind everyone, if you could just take 2 minutes to answer the survey that we will send you about our webinar ministry. So thank you once again for joining us tonight. So
Thank you.
Olof, if you could close this in prayer.
Yes, sure. Well, thank you, Lord Jesus, for our time together. And I just pray that you help us we need, and also the love that we need, meeting these people that we have been talking about, and also these ideologies that we've been talking about. I pray that you help us with a sound apologetics, but even more so with an attitude and a humility also in meeting people that are frail and wounded in these areas. Help us to keep together this issue of power analysis with the issue of truth, just as you yourself did in such a wonderful way. Thank you for being both lamb and lion, both grace and truth. Help us and help our churches to sort of embody that, meeting both the LGBTQ movement, but also, of course, other people that come across our path. We pray on your protection also on our lives, our families, and our churches. And we pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you again, Olof. And